Welcome to The Kill File, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown, because in The Kill File, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 24 of The Kill File. I hope that your holiday season was great. I'm about 3 or 4 weeks ahead in recording right now, so it's kind of barely into December, and the holidays haven't actually happened yet, but when you hear this, they will have happened. So whatever you celebrate or don't celebrate, I hope that you had a lovely break, hopefully from the hustle and bustle of this time of year. So first off, I want to say thank you for all of you who have shared any of the Kill Files info. I hope that you will continue to do so on your social pages or groups for true crime that you may be involved in. That's the best way to get the word out there so that we can grow our community and hopefully eventually get some sponsors. Yay! Also, sometime in the near future, I will be introducing some sort of monthly, Patreon subscription for bonus content for you guys. Let me know what you would want for bonus content. I'm thinking either maybe the bigger cases that I normally won't cover on here because I kind of like to do the smaller ones that people haven't heard of. I feel like the older ones or bigger ones, are just oversaturated, but there are some requests sometimes for episodes that I would have thought people had heard, but I don't think that they have. So let me know. It will probably be some kind of tiered thing so that no matter what your budget is, if you want a little extra from me, that you will be able to get it for cheap. This will help support the Kill File and help me with new equipment when it's needed, and we can keep on expanding and creating even more content for you guys because I love you and I want you to have the best of everything for me. Okay, enough business. Today's episode is a listener request, so shout out to Ryan for the suggestion. You guys, this is a wild one. I have heard this case before on some other podcasts, and I was just like, is this real life? Oh my God, wait until you hear this story. Today we are going to cover the case of Carl Tanzler, aka Carl von Cosel, the radiology technologist who did some pretty gnarly shit. So, trigger warnings for today is going to be necrophilia, body mutilation, and sexual assault. Let's jump in. Carl Tanzler was born on February 8th, 1877 in a place called Dresden, Germany. Sorry if I butchered that. Carl was also known as Count Carl von Cosel. Carl was said to have been a boy with unusual notions and, quote, particular obsessions. Carl would claim that during his childhood that he would see many visions from an ancestor of his named Countess Anna Constantina von Cosel. How did he know this was his ancestor? Carl would go on to also claim that during some of the visions from his ancestor that she would go on to show him the face of who his one true love would apparently be throughout his life. He described this face as a woman with dark hair and exotic features. Apparently this vision really messed with him throughout his life, and he truly believed that one day he would meet the love of his life from the visions. It is said that knowing Carl's exact background before he ends up moving to Key West, Florida, is muddled with the fact that he would sometimes exaggerate or make up stories about his life, and many believed that most of them were untrue. I did see in one source that Carl had at some point moved to Australia in the early 1900s. He was said to be living in Australia when World War I started, and because he was of German descent, he was placed in the concentration camp. After the war, it said that Carl would return to Germany, where he would marry his wife, Doris Schaefer, and the couple would go on to have 2 children. This happened in the early 1920s, and by 1926, Carl had decided his family should move to America, and this is where they would end up in Zephyr Hills, Florida. Carl also allegedly had many degrees under his belt. It was said to have been within many different areas of knowledge, but it is believed that these 2 may have been exaggerated or even made up. However, let's remember the 1800s or early 1900s of it all as we listen to this story. It's not exactly like people could look up his license on an online database like we can now. I wonder just how many people would doctor up awards, licenses, certificates, or even degrees without anyone questioning it. Wild times. Just 1 year after his family had moved to Florida, Carl would up and leave his wife and kids behind in Zephyr Hills to take a job at a U.S. Marine hospital in Key West. Carl's possible lack of degrees did not stop him from taking the job. As a radiology technologist, Carl would use different measures to gain confidence from patients and their families in his abilities to quote-unquote cure patients. So it was said that he would use medical jargon, grandiose claims about his own abilities and expertise, as well as his charm, to make even the most hopeless and terminal patients believe in his abilities to help them. Carl was not just motivated by wanting to help other people and cure ailments, but what else seemed to motivate Carl was the thought of finding his quote-unquote one true love that his ancestor had showed him. It would be through this job that he would meet Miss Elena de Hoyos. Carl's life would be forever changed when he met Elena de Hoyos on April 22nd, 1930, when she was brought into the hospital by her mother. Elena was diagnosed, unfortunately, with TB, tuberculosis, which was awful. So many of us have heard of TB and know a little bit, but I wanted to learn a little bit more about it because it was just so big in this time period and throughout history. So tuberculosis, or TB, was known by a few different names throughout history. You guys, I researched every name that it showed on the CDC website throughout history and listened to the pronunciations so that I could say them correctly. But please forgive me, as I am positive I am still going to butcher them. The only one that I could absolutely not find the second half of the word, no matter how hard I tried, was the one that was in ancient Hebrew. I could only find the first part of it. So tuberculosis was actually called phthisis in ancient Greece. Then it was known as tabes in ancient Rome. And it would be called shah-ha-peh in ancient Hebrew. I spent a really long time trying to find that word online, far too long. So in the 1700s, this illness was called the White Plague because it made patients who had it so pale. You will also hear in history that it's called consumption, even after the 1800s, when it was finally named tuberculosis in 1834 by a man named Johann Schönlein. It is also believed that the illness had been around for as long as 3 million years, which is just nuts, and some guess even longer. Also, fun fact, according to the CDC website, in the early 1800s, there was something called vampire panics that were spread throughout New England in that area, and when a TB outbreak had occurred in one specific town. It was thought that the first member of a family who would go on to die of TB would come back as a vampire and infect the rest of their family. Yeah. It also said to stop these quote-unquote vampires, people in town would become full-on grave diggers and exhume a suspected vampire's remains from their graves to perform rituals. Thank God for science, huh? So what exactly is tuberculosis? So TB, or consumption, is a very serious illness of the lungs, and the germs that actually cause TB are a type of bacteria. This is why science eventually figured out that there could be treatments for TB. However, there are now some types of this bacteria that don't respond well to treatments that we actually have, which is scary, and it actually happens a lot with infections and other illnesses like superbugs. We know that TB is an airborne illness, which is why it was so scary, because someone who's infected by TB can spread the disease just from talking, singing, speaking, and of course, if they're coughing. They do contact tracing when it comes to someone being infected with TB, to their families or anyone else who has come in contact with them, and then they're treated, of course. So TB is obviously an infection of the lungs, but not necessarily exclusive to the lungs, which I found interesting. I did read that TB, or consumption, has actually claimed the lives of over 1 billion people, which is just insane. Some of the nicknames for TB were, quote, robber of youth, captain of all these men of death, graveyard coughs, and king's evil. I particularly prefer king's evil. I like that one. So what were the treatments at this time? In my research, I found that in the Middle Ages, they would actually treat this disease with, quote-unquote, the royal touch, meaning that people would line up for the English and French king and queen to touch them, hoping that this would cure them, like magic. In the early 1800s, they would use, quote, cod liver oil, vinegar, massages, and inhaling hemlock or turpentine, end quote. So, hemlock is actually a very poisonous plant and has killed people who have accidentally mistaken it for parsley, wild celery, I know I'm going to say this wrong, is it anise or anise? I have no idea, and parsnip. So according to the WebMD website, quote, despite serious safety concerns, hemlock is used for bronchitis, whooping cough, asthma, arthritis, and other conditions, but there is no good scientific evidence to support these uses, end quote. So I'm sure that the thought of using this plant to help with lung infections came from somewhere, and I couldn't find its origin though. But I did find that the symptoms of hemlock poisoning can vary from vomiting to seizures to actual respiratory failure and death. I learned that the appeal about hemlock was that it was thought to have a sedative and antispasmodic property, which makes sense that they would boil it in teas, etc., to try and calm down bronchial spasms when you're coughing. I read nothing but serious warnings about how scary this shit really is, and despite people trying to use it for certain conditions, that if you take it at all or use it at all, that you're supposed to seek immediate medical attention. I guess it's part of the carrot family, and there's no cure if you accidentally ingest it. It's said that every part of this plant, all the way down to the seeds, are toxic. So if you ever see this in your yard, fucking eradicate it safely. Ancient Greeks used hemlock to apparently execute their criminals, and the most famous example of this was Socrates. If anyone ever offers you hemlock for an ailment, apparently you should run for the hills. That's one treatment that they would use during this time, and the other one was turpentine. Now, turpentine, which is oil that's actually derived from the resin that's inside of pine trees, is now used as a paint thinner, and then is said to be added to a bunch of cosmetics and chest rubs. Excuse me? Then this source went on to say that sometimes it's distilled for use as flavoring agents in tiny amounts, but it's still toxic if ingested directly. So, upon looking further, its strong scent is used in things like perfumes, soaps, and things like Vicks Vapor Rub. It also went on to say that although there is very limited research of the health benefits of this on humans, that it should absolutely never be ingested. Here's some of the things that can happen if you do ingest it. Kidney failure, chest pain, vision loss, swelling of your throat, coughing, vomiting, low blood pressure, and blood in your urine. So yeah, these were what they were using to cure TB, quote unquote. It also states that older research actually indicates that inhaling turpentine oil directly can irritate your airways and pose dangers for people with respiratory conditions. So basically the two quote unquote treatments for TB at this time pose serious risks of death or other things. Fantastic. It wouldn't be until antibiotics came about that a treatment was successful for TB and had started to circulate. Around 1946 is when the main effective treatment and cure of TB was real and could actually show such a vast improvement. Although the bacteria was discovered and isolated well before this, other treatments that were rocky at best were the ones that they used, although they did help a little. So poor Elena had been diagnosed with this awful disease or sickness, and this is why her mother would bring her to the hospital, where she would go on to meet Carl in 1930. We don't know a whole lot about Elena's life prior to meeting Carl, but what we do know is that she was born in 1909 and had been at the very young age of 17 when she was married. Her husband was a man named Luis Mesa, and they got married in 1926. It was said that, unfortunately, Elena had suffered a miscarriage, and after this traumatic experience, Luis and Elena's marriage would fall apart, which is so sad. Unfortunately, TB would also infect Elena's family as well and would claim the lives of many around her. As we know, it spreads in families rampantly. Carl apparently, from the very moment he saw Elena's face, he realized this was the woman from his visions. Elena, being of Cuban descent, was not only absolutely beautiful, but also had exotic dark hair like the woman from his visions. I will make sure to upload pics on the Kill File social media platform so you guys can see her. She was really gorgeous. Unfortunately for Carl, as we know, Elena was already married. Despite the fact that Elena was already married and showed no signs of romantic interest in him, Carl was smitten. Obsessed, one might say. Elena's parents were Francisco, Pancho, Hoyos, and Aurora Milagro, who were said to be a local Key West family. Her mother was a homemaker, while her father was said to be a cigar maker. Elena had a sister by the name of Florinda Nana Hoyos, who would go on to be an important factor after the death of her sister. When Elena came into the hospital with TB, Carl, this self-proclaimed grandiose medical marvel, would attempt to cure her with what was said to be several unconventional methods. Which, this is just my opinion, but if I'm terminally ill and there is no cure, I would sure as shit let someone who told me that they were a doctor who was obviously so passionate about helping for whatever his reasons, I wouldn't care, try to cure me, because why the hell not? So, before anyone judges the family of Elena for taking the unconventional advice or actions of this so-called doctor, remember the early 1900s of it all, and that TB was basically still a death sentence. Of the many different ways that Carl would try to save Elena, some of which was said to involve even bringing in medical equipment and x-ray technology into the family's home, none would succeed. Carl's attempts at curing Elena also include strange, self-conceived remedies and included devices that were said to not really have a shot at working. Again, whatever. I would let him try too. You never know. During this time, Carl was trying to cure Elena. He was also said to have brought her gifts of love, including clothes, jewelry, and other items. Carl was also said to have told her of his infatuation and love for Elena, but that it was said Elena did not reciprocate his feelings. I mean, she was married, for goodness sakes. Unfortunately, no matter how hard Carl tried to save Elena, she would eventually go on to pass away from her tuberculosis infection on October 25th, 1931, at the young age of 22. So, I did a little math when I realized that she was only 22, and I remember Carl being much older if he was born in the 1870s. So at the time of her death, she was only 22, and Carl was 54. Gross. Like, I'm not judging anyone who has a huge gap between them and their spouse by any means, but seriously, 22 and 54? It gives me the ick. Anyways, Carl was absolutely devastated by her death. I mean, this was his one true love, the woman his ancestor had showed him. And by all accounts, the woman who he had been searching for his entire life. And now she was gone. Not only did Carl pay for Elena's funeral, which was very nice, albeit a weird gesture, but alright, he also was able to convince her family to allow him to build a, quote, ornate above-ground mausoleum for her in the Key West Cemetery, end quote. Her family did not realize at the time, but Carl actually had the key to this mausoleum, and he would visit Elena's remains almost every single night. Again, weird and a little creepy, but so far he hasn't really crossed any lines in my eyes. I mean, I understand he confessed his love to a married, very young, dying woman, and although it's not the best situation, I can understand it, and he did try to save her life. And he also did help her family out by paying for expenses at the end, so it's whatever. But it won't stay innocent for long. So, as Carl was going along and visiting Elena almost nightly in the month of April 1933, Carl would make a decision that would be disconcerting, to say the least. Carl would later on claim that Elena's spirit would visit him while he was at her mausoleum often, and he further went on to say that her spirit was trying to urge him to take her from where she rested. Yeah. So one dark evening, Carl made the decision to remove Elena's body from her mausoleum, and he did this by taking her home on a, quote, toy wagon. I'm sorry, all I can picture is this grown-ass man, supposedly a doctor, taking a woman's remains like 6 full months after she died and loaded them into a little red wagon and just walking her home. Like, what in the actual fuck? This is said to be when Carl would start a disturbing, disgusting, and all-around fucked up plan of preserving his love, Elena, keeping her in his life in one form or another. So, as we all know, human flesh deteriorates and decomposes over time. In fact, it starts pretty quickly. This did not stop Carl from trying to preserve his love Elena for as long as he could. Carl had decided that he could not just let go of the love of his life and let her rest in peace. He decided to keep her close one way or another and would go through great lengths trying to preserve her appearance. Carl would go on to try things like replacing her skin with a concoction of what was said to be plaster of Paris, milk, and wax to try to preserve her skin. He would tie her bones together with piano wire as well as coat hangers. He was said to have fixed her eyes with glass eyeballs and even gave her some eyeglasses just to give her a more realistic and lifelike appearance. I'm sorry, glass eyes? So on top of all this macabre shit, he had to take her eyes out? Of course, as her body was decomposing, her hair started to fall out, so Carl made a wig from hair that he had, quote, earlier collected from Elena's mother, end quote. What? I have so many questions about this. Was it Elena's hair? Was it her mother's? Why did he have to use that specific hair? And of course, the looming question of, what the fuck is Carl doing here? It was said that Carl would go on to stuff Elena's abdominal cavity and chest with rags of some sort so that her body would keep the shape of a human being, and even dressed her in very nice clothing, jewelry, and gloves. So this whole time, as morbid as it is, I'm thinking, wouldn't that smell so badly and wretched that it would be hard to be around, right? Well, Carl would use disinfectants and perfumes to mask the smell of her decomposing body, as he would keep her remains in his bed, are you ready for this? For the next 7 years. Oh my God! 7 years! It was said that whilst Elena's corpse was living with Carl, he would dine with her and have deep, meaningful conversations with her. Okay, you guys, as if this isn't disturbing enough, this next part is sure to give you fucking nightmares. So, apparently Carl would go as far as inserting what was said to be a paper tube into the pelvic area of Elena's remains, allegedly to make intercourse easier. What the fuck? Ew! And holy shit, this poor woman deserved to just rest in peace. And this is anything but peaceful. So, in one source, it stated that, I guess after all of this came to light later on, some of the locals had some sort of romanticized notion of Carl going through all of this effort for his one true love, which to me is fucking bonkers, but okay, I get it. He loved her and he just wanted to keep her as long as he could. However, when people found out that he was using her for his necrophiliac acts, people started to feel differently. During the time that Carl went on living with Elena's corpse as his live-in quote-unquote girlfriend, he would routinely buy her clothes, perfumes, and reapplied wax to her face. Eventually, people started noticing these oddities of Carl's habits in buying women's clothing, and of course, the sudden change of him not visiting Elena's mausoleum anymore. Questions started to form. His neighbors would come out later and speak to the fact that he could be seen during some evenings dancing with what they would later learn to be Elena's corpse through the window. Elena's sister would finally decide to confront Carl inside of his home in October of 1940. When Carl would let Florinda, or Nana, Hoyos into his home, she would see the horror of what she thought was a wax dummy of her sister. One source would say that Carl actually said, quote, "Elena, your sister is here." Can you imagine hearing all of these rumors of this man who all of a sudden stopped visiting your sister's grave after so much obsession, then hearing that he had been seen dancing with what was thought to be a doll, and then find what looks like your sister's wax doll in his home? Holy shit. I can't imagine what she felt in that moment. What a fucking weirdo. So, after the confrontation between the two, Florinda went on to alert the authorities, who in turn seized the quote-unquote doll. And this is when they would discover that it was actually her rotting corpse and her remains. Carl was in turn, of course, arrested, and he actually did go to trial. Carl's crime was said to be, quote, maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. Unfortunately, Carl would never be tried for these crimes because by the time he was caught, the statute of limitations had expired on the crimes. Apparently, the public was not as enraged as you would think upon discovery of Carl's secret lifestyle, but rather hovered around fascination. After the discovery of what was going on inside Carl's home, Elena's partially mummified and preserved body would then be put on display at what was said to be a local funeral home called the Dean Lopez Funeral Home, where almost 7,000 people came to see her. I don't know how I feel about this because on the one hand, I'm like, hasn't this lady been through enough? And on the other hand, I'm like, I would have totally went and saw that. Who wouldn't? 7,000 people? I totally get it. One source went as far as to claim that schools had even closed early so that children could see Elena's body on display, which to me is just weird and sad for those kids. I don't like that part. Carl continued to be obsessed with Elena even after he had been caught with her corpse. Apparently, he had even stated that he had plans to, quote, fly Elena's body into the stratosphere on an airship where radiation would bring her back to life, end quote. Wow. I don't even know what to say about that. How did he imagine that resurrection going in his head? Did he think her TB would be gone? Did he think she would be so grateful to be back from the dead that she would love him forever and not her actual husband? Did he think that she would just forgive him for keeping her corpse as a sex doll of sorts and, trigger warning, raping her corpse? Ugh, this fucking weirdo. It was said that after everything came out, Carl was sent to live somewhere near his ex-wife, I guess, but that he was still obsessed with his fantasies and wasn't sorry for any of his actions. He continued to dream of the resurrection of his love. Sometime later, Elena's remains would be reburied in an unmarked and secret gravesite in an attempt to let Elena rest in peace and to keep anyone, especially Carl, from disturbing her again. However, this did not stop Carl from asking to have her remains back, which is just beyond belief for me. Carl would continue to be obsessed with Elena, so he used her death mask as a model for her face and created a sculpture or model of her. And he would live with this model of Elena until he died on July 3rd in the year of 1952. So, a death mask, for anyone who is unsure, is something that used to happen for people who had passed away as a sort of memento of their lives. They used to take, plaster casts of people's faces after they died so that people could cherish their memories and having this sculpture of their face, I guess. Holy shit, what is the word that's beyond obsession? It was said that upon finding the remains of Carl after he passed, he would be apparently found in the arms of this statue or model of Elena 3 weeks after he had passed away. However, in his actual obituary, they only said that Carl died on the floor of his home behind one of his organs that I guess he owned. Then the obituary stated that they had found a waxen image wrapped in silk cloth and inside a robe, alluding to Elena's doll-like doppelganger. After Carl had passed, an author by the name of Tom Swieskud wrote a book about Carl and his life called Von Caussel, or Von Caussel. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Sorry about that. And in it, he stated that Carl had actually switched Elena and her body double before he died, and that he actually died in the arms of his love. I wasn't sure how true this was or not, but I did find an old newspaper called the St. Petersburg Times, dated August 17th, 1952, in which the detail of Carl's home at the time of his death were published. The paper stated that inside of a shallow metallic coffin, which was on the desk that was littered with items inside the small cabin where Carl finished out his days, was a, quote, silk-gowned effigy of the once beautiful Spanish girl still lies in state, end quote. When I first started my research, I came across the word effigy and of course was like, well, what the fuck is that? So for those of us who don't know, an effigy is just a fancy-ass word for a sculpture or model of a person. The paper would go on to say, quote, to those who examined it yesterday under the direction of County Judge A.J. Hayward, the figure conveyed little impression of life or death. It seemed more like an expressionless, life-sized doll whose black hair, decked with faded, artificial flowers and imitation jewelry, appeared to be its only human attribute, end quote. After this statement was a tidbit about how this could still be the original remains, as apparently one of the Key West undertakers, who was now unfortunately dead at the time, was quoted as saying that Carl had stolen Elena's body from her secret grave that her family had buried it in 1940. And then it said that he brought it to his secluded cabin, where he lived out the rest of his days. this man will just not stop. I love the sentiment of how much he loved this woman, but not the actions. It was said that upon examining, it felt that there was a clear dividing line between the shoulders and the head of the quote-unquote doll, which was said to be, for sure, in some areas to be made of plaster of Paris. They could also tell that a similar material was used. There was a, quote, shapeless, stuffed canvas body, minus legs or arms, end quote. It was stated that this doll of sorts had on a brand new yellow silk robe, as well as a Spanish shawl, and 2 neatly and new folded handkerchiefs that were also tucked into the robe or gown. Unfortunately, until the doll could be examined more thoroughly by physicians, they couldn't be sure if there were human remains or not included in the doll. Carl was found in his cabin surrounded by what was said to be pieces and parts of what were his quote-unquote professional equipment from his work that he professed made him an electrotherapist. One of the things left in his death was some of what was called an incubator that Carl had claimed to apparently partially restored his love Elena's body in. I have no idea what partially restored means when it comes to someone's remains. This just screams mental illness to me, and it's sad. They also found parts of an X-ray machine as well as equipment for blood transfusions, old clothes, stacks of newspapers, and some sardine tins. It also seems as though Carl had some sort of makeshift shrine of Elena in his bedroom, and it was described as, quote, lying on the worn boudoir pillows of the grimy bed in which von Kassel slept is a plaster plaque of the girl's head. The lifeless features contrast with 3 vivid photographs of the 19-year-old Spanish beauty, which smile down upon it. A crucifix and rosary hang over the bed, end quote. Yikes. I don't know why, but it completely grossed me out to hear the bed described as grimy. I feel like that's the last thing that you would want your bed described as. But boy, what a picture this paper paints, huh? I feel like I can see it. The article would further explain that inside the cabin were photos of Elena everywhere. The paper further talked on the aircraft registration that Carl had and a broken down plane that was said to be on the property, where he was believed to also have kept Elena's remains for some time at one point. His neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Pattison, said that they would often get groceries for Carl but refused to step foot in his house because of the clutter. Miss Pattison said that Carl would speak to her pretty often about his attempts to bring Elena back to life, but she would say that it seemed to be rather a scientific project and not as much about the love he had for her. I'm sure the obsession with his love for Elena isn't something that he spoke about to other people, as he was already in trouble for what he did, and I think it's safe to say that he took this way past a scientific experiment by inserting a tube into her vagina so he could have sex with her remains. It would take his neighbors 3 weeks to realize that he was dead in his house and alert the authorities because their quote-unquote eccentric neighbor would often disappear out of nowhere for random trips. It wasn't until the Pattisons noticed a strong stench coming from the cabin that they called it in to the police. And that, my friends, is the story of Carl Tanzler, radiology technician, wooer of the dead, and necrophiliac. Yikes, you guys, this story is fucking wild. I have so many questions about Carl and what the hell was going on inside his head. Like, did he know that she was dead and acknowledged this and it was not really her anymore? Like, he knew it wasn't really her anymore, but he was just rather desperate to hang on to her memory by just replacing her parts forever? What were the deep conversations that he had with her about? Did she talk back to him? Like, obviously she didn't, but in his head, did she? What was his obsession with this woman? Why was it so strong? And why couldn't he just let her go and rest in peace? I just want to sit down and pick his brain and figure out all of the things inside this guy's mind. And also have like a psychologist tell me what his mental illnesses are, because Carl had to have suffered from something, right? Wow, what a freaky journey. Honestly, I feel bad for Carl, like he was clearly going through some shit. I also feel really bad for Elena's family having to know that this frickin' weirdo had their loved one and was sexually assaulting her corpse. Gross. So I was gonna use the R word like I did earlier, but then it got me thinking, is necrophilia a form of sexual abuse or, trigger warning, rape? Or is it not? Because in my head, they are obviously not giving consent, which is rape. So I decided to look this up, you guys, and I went down a fucking rabbit hole on arguments and articles from laws and medical resources and even Oxford Law on whether or not necrophilia is a form of rape or not. I have no answer, and the law seems unclear, but it is definitely illegal and will land you some jail time. It does happen, though. In that research, it also pointed out some of the most famous serial killers who committed this heinous crime with their victims. Ugh, it was gross. So if you're a curious cat like me and decide to do some research on the subject, it's interesting to say the least. All right, that is going to be it for today on Carl, Elena, and his doll of sorts. I cannot wait to show you guys the picture. I will definitely post it, probably Wednesday or Thursday of this week, as I usually do. I hope that you guys enjoyed this story, and I hope that you guys will come back next Monday for another episode of The Kill File. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. Well, that's it for today, you guys. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and listening to another episode of The Kill File. Don't forget to check out the merch shop, either at thekillfile.com and click Shop Merch, or you can visit thekillfile.printify.me/products for some awesome true crime merch. Also, follow along on the Kill File's socials for posts about episodes, pictures about the cases, for updates, and more. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and X as The Kill File, and we are on YouTube and TikTok as The Kill File Podcast. Also, feel free to check out the website at thekillfile.com, where you can learn more about me, your host. You can learn a little bit more about how The Kill File got started, and you can suggest a case right there on the website. Let me know in your case suggestion if you want me to shout out your name if I cover your case. There is contact info on the site as well. You guys have no idea how much I love to hear from you. It makes my whole day. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.